In October of 1944, Tokyo told its people the American fleet was gone. Every ship they had buried was still afloat, and all 17 of them were already coming.
Imperial General Headquarters announces that our sea and air forces in the waters east of Formosa have sunk 11 enemy aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 3 cruisers. That communiqué went out from Tokyo in the middle of October 1944, and Japan believed every word of it. The announcement was read across the home islands on national radio. Newspapers cleared their front pages. Crowds gathered in the streets of Tokyo to celebrate what was described as the greatest naval victory in the history of the empire. Factory shifts were halted so workers could hear the numbers read aloud. School children were given a holiday. An imperial rescript was issued praising the men who had, it was said, destroyed the American fleet in a single week of fighting. Measured against the claims, it was bigger than Pearl Harbor. 11 carriers was more than the entire American carrier force had been at the start of the war. If it were true, the Pacific War had just been reversed. Not one of those ships had been sunk. Not a single American carrier, battleship, or cruiser had gone to the bottom in the waters east of Formosa, and the fleet Tokyo had just announced destroyed was, at that moment, steaming south at 20 knots toward the Philippines with every flight deck intact. This is not a story about lying. That is the easy version, and it is wrong. Almost nobody in this story was deliberately lying. It is a story about a decision, the worst kind of decision, the kind where a commander must choose whether to believe his own men, and where both answers lead somewhere terrible. Because within days of that communiqué, the Japanese High Command had to decide what to do with a victory it could not verify. Commit everything now, while the American fleet was supposedly crippled, or hold back and risk missing the one opening the war would ever offer. They chose to believe it, and that choice, more than any battleship or any battle line, is what destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy over the following 2 weeks. To see how it happened, you have to start with why hundreds of American aircraft appeared over Formosa in the first place. By October 1944, the United States was preparing to invade the Philippines. The landings were set for the island of Leyte, and once American troops were ashore, Japan's supply route to the oil of the South would be cut. But Leyte sat within range of Japanese air power, based on the island of Formosa, modern Taiwan, roughly 600 miles to the north. Formosa was a fortress of airfields, and every one of them could send aircraft against the invasion fleet. So before a single American soldier landed on Leyte, those airfields had to be broken. That job went to Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, and specifically to its carrier striking arm, Task Force 38, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Task Force 38 was, at that moment, the most powerful naval formation that had ever existed. 17 aircraft carriers steaming in 4 groups, with fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers around them, and something on the order of 1,000 aircraft aboard. It could put more aircraft into the sky in one morning than most nations owned. And on the 12th of October, it arrived off Formosa and began taking the island apart. The strikes came in continuous waves. Hellcat fighter sweeps went in first to clear the sky, then Helldivers and Avengers worked over the airfields, hangars, fuel dumps, and shipping in the harbors. For 3 days, the Americans hammered Formosa and the nearby Ryukyu Islands. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground in rows. Hangars burned. Harbor shipping was left sitting on the bottom in shallow water. The Japanese defense, on paper, should have been formidable. The 6th Base Air Force on Formosa had been reinforced heavily in the weeks before, precisely because Tokyo expected an American move in this direction. Its commander was Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, and he had something else on his hands as well. By an accident of timing, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the commander-in-chief of the entire combined fleet, was reportedly on Formosa that week on an inspection visit. So the most senior officer in the Japanese Navy was physically present, on the island, while it was being bombed. He watched a good part of this battle happen in front of him. And what Fukudome had to fight with was the problem that ran through everything Japan did in the last year of the war. He had aircraft. He did not have pilots. Japan's naval flight training program had been steadily collapsing under the pressure of losses, fuel shortages, and time. The veterans of 1942 were largely dead. The men now flying were replacements, many with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had. They were brave, and there were a great many of them, and they were sent up against the best-trained carrier fighter pilots in the world, in aircraft they barely knew. The results over Formosa were exactly what you would expect. Japanese aircraft went into the sky in numbers and came back in fractions. Over those days, Japan is generally reckoned to have lost something on the order of 500 aircraft in and around Formosa. American losses ran to fewer than 100. But losing aircraft was not the disaster. The disaster was which aircraft they were. Those were not local defense units. Many of the air groups thrown into the Formosa fighting were the reserves that had been carefully rebuilt over months for one specific purpose: the decisive battle that Japan still believed it could fight. They were, in effect, the seed corn. And they were spent, in 3 days, defending an island the Americans never intended to invade. Now the second half of the battle began, the part Japan actually chose to fight, and the part that produced the communiqué. Japanese doctrine had a specialized answer to American carrier power. It was called Air Group T, the T standing for Typhoon, a unit trained specifically to attack ships at night and in filthy weather, when American fighters could not effectively defend and American gunners could not see. On paper, it was a sound idea. Come in low, at dusk or after dark, in weather that hides you, and put torpedoes into carriers before anybody knows you are there. In practice, it created the single most dangerous condition in aerial warfare: young, inexperienced crews attacking at night, over water, against a target they could only glimpse as a shape and a muzzle flash. On the 13th of October, one of those attacks got through. An aerial torpedo struck the American heavy cruiser Canberra on her starboard side, tearing open her engineering spaces below the armor belt. Water flooded in on the order of 4,000 tons. Around 20 of her crew were killed. Canberra lost all power and went dead in the water, roughly 100 miles off an island covered in enemy airfields. By every ordinary rule of naval warfare, she should have been scuttled. She was immobilized, deep inside the enemy's air umbrella, and towing her out would tie down warships that Halsey needed elsewhere for the Leyte operation. Halsey decided to tow her home. A cruiser took her under tow, then a fleet tug, and a screen of ships formed around the wounded Canberra to walk her out of danger at a crawl. The next evening, they did it again. Another torpedo, this time into the light cruiser Houston, hit her almost squarely amidships and flooded her engineering spaces. Houston's case was worse than Canberra's. Accounts put the water she took on at something over 6,000 tons, more than a third of her own displacement. She settled so low that her main deck was awash, and her list made movement aboard difficult. Her damage control parties fought for hours in flooded compartments and darkness to save her. Around 55 of her crew were lost. The ship survived because men refused to leave her, not because anything about her condition justified optimism. And then, on the 16th, in the middle of being towed away at a few knots, Houston was hit by a second aerial torpedo. It tore off part of her stern structure and knocked out the hangar. She still did not sink. In the end, Houston was towed roughly 1,500 miles to the anchorage at Ulithi, one of the most remarkable salvage efforts of the entire Pacific War. Now here is where Halsey did something that turned Japan's own optimism into a weapon. He had 2 badly crippled cruisers being towed slowly westward, escorted by a handful of ships. To the Japanese, that looked exactly like the tail end of a beaten fleet limping away from a catastrophe. So Halsey formed those ships into their own task group under Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubose and let them keep crawling. Officially, the formation was Cripple Division 1. The fleet's own name for it was blunter, Bait Div 1. The idea was simple and cold. If Japan believed the American fleet was shattered, Japan might send surface ships out to finish off the wounded, and those ships would sail straight into the guns and aircraft of a task force that was not shattered at all. And Japan very nearly took it. A striking force of cruisers and destroyers under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima was ordered out from home waters to hunt down the American remnants. It got underway, It steamed toward the reported position. For a short while, the trap was actually closing on schedule. Then Japanese scouting aircraft found what was really out there. American carriers, plural, in formation, operating aircraft normally. Not wreckage, not survivors, a working fleet. Shima's force was recalled. The bait went untaken, and the two crippled cruisers were allowed to crawl away to safety. But sit with what that recall means. Somebody in the Japanese chain of command already had hard evidence on the 16th of October that the American carrier force was intact. That evidence existed. It was reported, and within days it was overwhelmed by a set of numbers that everyone wanted to be true. This is the exact point where the war turned, and almost nobody talks about it, which is why this channel exists. Subscribe now if you want the parts of the Pacific War that get skipped. And stay with me, because the last few minutes of this story explain something you may have wondered about for years. Why Japan's aircraft carriers sailed into the greatest naval battle in history with almost no aircraft aboard them. So where did 11 carriers come from? To understand that, you have to sit in the cockpit of a 19-year-old Japanese pilot at night, in bad weather, over open ocean. He has perhaps a few hundred hours of flying time, much of it in training aircraft. He has never attacked a ship before. He is flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire he cannot see the source of. He drops his torpedo at a dark shape, and somewhere behind him there is a flash on the water. It might be his weapon hitting a ship. It might be another aircraft going in. It might be a shell burst, or a flare, or a burning plane on the sea. He turns for home, and if he survives the flight, he reports what he honestly believes he saw. A hit, a fire, an explosion, a large ship burning. Now multiply that by hundreds of aircrew across several nights in the same patch of ocean, all reporting honestly, and all reporting the same handful of real events from different angles. 2 damaged American cruisers, seen and re-reported through darkness and rain by inexperienced crews, can arithmetically become a dozen sinking capital ships. Nobody has to lie. The system simply adds everything up. And in the Japanese reporting structure of 1944, there was nothing effective standing between those raw claims and the front page. No photographic confirmation, no systematic reconnaissance follow-up over the target waters, no institutional habit of discounting. There were officers who doubted. Fukudome is reported to have been skeptical of the scale of the claims coming out of his own command. Doubts were raised at several levels. It did not matter. By the time the doubts were being voiced, the numbers had already been announced to the nation, celebrated by the nation, and blessed by an imperial rescript. And that is the trap. Once a victory has been publicly declared at that altitude, correcting it is no longer a military act. It is a political humiliation. So now come back to the dilemma, and look at it the way Tokyo had to look at it in the 3rd week of October 1944. Option 1. Treat the Formosa claims as real. The American carrier fleet is crippled. This is the moment. Commit the entire remaining Japanese Navy to the defense of the Philippines immediately, while the enemy is weak. Option 2. Treat the claims as inflated. Accept that the American fleet is intact. Hold the fleet back. Refuse the battle. Keep the ships alive. And watch the Philippines fall without a fight, which means watching the oil route close and the war end by strangulation. Look carefully, and you will see the shape of the trap. Option 1 meant fighting a battle against an enemy far stronger than reported. Option 2 meant surrendering the strategic position without a shot. There was no third door. By October 1944, Japan had run out of good options months earlier. The Formosa reports simply chose which bad one would happen. They took option 1. On the 18th of October, with American landings beginning in the Philippines, the plan for the decisive naval battle was activated, and the Japanese fleet was committed. Now watch what the Formosa battle had actually done to the force that was being sent out. Japan's carrier force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa still existed as ships. 4 carriers and their escorts were available for the operation. The hulls were fine, but the air groups that were supposed to fly from them had just been consumed defending Formosa. The reserves had been spent chasing an enemy who had already flown home. When Ozawa's carriers sailed for the Philippines, their combined air strength was on the order of 100 aircraft for the whole force, a fraction of what those decks were designed to carry, and nowhere near enough to fight a carrier battle. So Japan's aircraft carriers, the ships that had opened the war at Pearl Harbor, were now useless as carriers, and Japanese planners did the only thing left to do with them. They offered them as bait. Ozawa's near-empty carriers were sent north to be seen, to be chased, and to pull the American carrier fleet away from the invasion beaches at Leyte. Read that again, because it is one of the strangest reversals of the entire war. Halsey had just tried to bait Japan with 2 crippled cruisers and failed. 2 weeks later, Japan baited Halsey with 4 crippled carriers, and it worked. And there was one more consequence, the darkest one, and it comes directly out of the same arithmetic. With the trained air groups gone, and green replacements arriving faster than they could be taught, Japanese commanders in the Philippines faced a brutal calculation. An inexperienced pilot, in a conventional attack, had almost no chance of hitting an American ship. In the days after Formosa, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines and organized the first formal special attack units, aircraft flown deliberately into American ships. The first organized attacks of that kind came at the end of October, off the island of Samar, where a small American escort carrier was hit and sunk. It was the beginning of a campaign that would run until the last weeks of the war. That tactic was not born out of fanaticism alone. It was born out of an aircraft inventory, with no trained pilots left to fly it, and a large part of that shortage was created in the skies over Formosa in October 1944. Meanwhile, the fleet Tokyo had announced destroyed was going about its business. Halsey had been reading the Japanese radio claims with something close to amusement. Radio Tokyo was announcing the destruction of ships whose captains were signaling him routine position reports. So he sent a message to Admiral Nimitz that has outlived almost everything else about this battle. All Third Fleet ships recently reported, sunk by Radio Tokyo, he reported, had been salvaged, and were retiring at high speed toward the enemy. It is one of the great lines in American naval history, and it works because of the direction. Not retiring away, retiring toward. And that is precisely what happened. Within a week of being declared sunk, those same carriers were operating off the Philippines, covering the Leyte landings and putting aircraft over Japanese fleet units in confined waters. Japan had committed its navy to a decisive battle on the assumption that the American carrier force was crippled. It sailed into the Philippines and discovered that the ships it had celebrated destroying were all still there. What followed was the largest naval battle in history, and it cost Japan most of what remained of its fleet. Battleships, cruisers, the last operational carriers, the losses across those few days effectively ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. And you can trace a straight line from that outcome back to a communiqué read out on the radio in Tokyo while people cheered in the streets. Because a false victory does not just misinform, it commits. It makes the cautious option look like cowardice, and the reckless option look like duty. You cannot plan a battle around a victory that never happened. Japan tried, and it lost a navy doing it. The Americans, for their part, took something entirely different away from those days. Task Force 38 had proved it could park off a major enemy island for the better part of a week, absorb everything that island could throw at it, and keep operating. 2 cruisers had been crippled, and neither had been lost. The industrial and damage control depth of the American fleet meant that ships which should have been abandoned were instead towed 1,000 miles and repaired. That is the quieter lesson buried in this story. The gap between the two navies was no longer about courage or tactics. It was about whether a fleet could take a hit and still be a fleet afterwards. Canberra and Houston were both eventually put back into service. Houston's survival, after taking 2 torpedoes and over 6,000 tons of water, remains one of the most extraordinary damage control stories in naval history. As for the men who filed those reports over Formosa, most of them never learned what their honest, mistaken claims had set in motion. Many of them did not survive the following month. They were not liars. They were undertrained young men sent to attack the world's most powerful fleet at night in bad weather, who reported what they genuinely believed they had seen into a system that had no way to check them and every reason not to. The failure was not in the cockpit. It was in a command structure that had lost the ability to tell itself unwelcome news, and in a public announcement that made the truth impossible to admit. 11 carriers sunk, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, a national celebration, an imperial rescript, and a fleet that was never touched. 2 weeks later, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed out to fight the battle those numbers had promised, and it did not come back. And the strangest part of what happened next is what became of Ozawa's 4 empty carriers, the decoys, sent north with almost nothing aboard, hunted down off Cape Engano by the very fleet Tokyo had already buried. That is the story next. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.